New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring the fathers of Renaissance esoteric magic. In particular, we'll be looking at Marsilio Ficino, Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, otherwise known as Paracelsus. My guest is Ronnie Pontiac, who worked as Manly P. Hall's research assistant, screener, and designated substitute lecturer for 7 years. I'm sure Ronnie will be touching on other great Renaissance figures such as John Dee and Giovanni Pico Della Mirandola. Ronnie has produced award-winning documentaries and has written articles for esoteric magazines. He is the author of American Metaphysical Religion, Esoteric and Mystical Traditions of the New World. He lives in Los Angeles, and he is co-author with his wife Tamra Lucid of The Magic of the Orphic Hymns, a new translation for the modern mystic. And now, I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Ronnie. It's a pleasure to be with you once again.
As always, an honor and a pleasure to be able to spend some time with you, Jeffrey.
We're going to be talking about people whose names are not that familiar in the 21st century. They were probably more familiar to earlier generations where Renaissance scholarship was probably considered more important. These days, I am under the impression that we don't think so much about the Renaissance.
I would agree with you, although I feel that they are timely in that they represent the ability to create a Renaissance during a time when there was a real force for conformity, and the church basically controlled every aspect of life. And through these three people, an entirely different perspective was born. So it's not only the historical Renaissance, but I think they exemplify the ability to create a Renaissance personally and collectively.
And the reason it's called the Renaissance has to do with the rebirth of vast amounts of material from the ancient Greek and Roman cultures that had basically been lost during what we think of as the Dark Ages.
Yes, precisely. There was no Plato, there was no Neoplatonists, there was no Hermetica. All of these things had been lost, were either hidden away in monasteries. Often people didn't even know what the manuscripts were. And a lot of it was preserved in the world of the Arab nations, where their scholarship was much more proficient and dedicated to keeping the knowledge alive. So when some of these manuscripts made it to Europe, it was a very important event. And through these people, especially Ficino, it influenced the history of Europe in amazing ways, and I think continues to very much influence culture. First, I want to thank you for being the one to suggest that we look at Ficino, Agrippa, and Paracelsus together, because they together are this tremendous force that transforms European culture. And Ficino was a great influence on both Agrippa and Paracelsus. And so seeing them together, they kind of emerge as this holy trinity of the Western esoteric tradition, as we'll see.
I gather that Ficino's primary influence wasn't So much that he was espousing unique original ideas, but that he was translating the ancient Hermetic texts and the works of Plato.
Yes, he was the one who restored the work of the Neoplatonists, the work of Plato, and some of the Hermetica back to European culture after it had been lost for generations. And by doing so, he also in his own life exemplified these principles by performing the Orphic Hymns, as we've discussed in an earlier talk that we had. And in those performances at the renewed Platonic Academy, he was dealing with and inspiring people like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Lorenzo the Magnificent, Poliziano, Pico della Mirandola. So all these lights of the Italian Renaissance that gave birth to the Renaissance throughout Europe were really sparked by Ficino.
Let's talk about how his career originated. I gather that his talents were already noticed when he was still a child.
Yeah, he was a brilliant child. And so his father was the physician to Cosimo de' Medici, who was the ruler of Florence, and was someone who was very deeply involved in trying to stimulate culture and art and really have the Renaissance ideal, as we later call it, the Renaissance, in his heart. And he first met Ficino when Ficino was only 10 years old. And the story goes that when he first spoke to this child, he was so impressed that he turned around to Ficino's father, his doctor, and said, "Your Marsilio here has been sent down from heaven to heal souls." And he was so impressed that he moved Marsilio into his household. He had just recently built this magnificent Palazzo Medici, and Ficino was brought there so that he could study. And he was such a good student, he just excelled, that Cosimo, at a very young age, appointed him to be his grandson Lorenzo's tutor. And this was going to be Lorenzo the Magnificent, a future ruler of Florence.
His career got off to a great start.
It did. He became this sort of, everyone was expecting from him some sort of tremendous creations or accomplishments, and he certainly wanted to be a great contributor to culture, and he was very driven by trying to understand what the best way to live might be. And this is something that really drew Cosimo to him, because as Cosimo became older and his health became more frail, he was not finding the answers that he was looking for in the church. He wasn't feeling comforted. And so he had run into, well, let me back it up for a minute. Well, I want to explain how Ficino got to being this guy who translated Plato and everything, because that was not an easy thing to do in a world where the church really didn't want Plato translated, because Plato was considered a competition for the Christian viewpoint about the afterlife and about the nature of the soul and about how to live an appropriate life. The church accepted Aristotle. And Aristotle was the one great thinker of ancient Greece that was still active in those days, because the church long ago, through people like St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas, had decided that his thinking was useful and didn't really contradict the Christian teachings too much. So at first, he's studying Aristotle for the most part. It's around 1457. He's now 24 years old, and he has a crisis. His crisis is that he is trying to put together a little book of what's available from Plato, which is very little at that time. But he's so interested in Plato that he tries to bring together these fragments and make some kind of coherent statement about them. But while he's doing this, his father and the Archbishop of Florence decide that he should not be doing this, that he should be studying only Aristotle. So he is very dutiful. He sets aside his Platonic work, and he starts to work on a commentary on Lucretius, this Roman Epicurean philosopher and poet who was very influenced by Aristotle and was okay by the church. They thought that he was a more acceptable subject than Plato. But soon, Ficino abandoned the project and he sank into this deep depression because he felt that he was way off track in his life. And he was already at that point beginning to become interested in astrology. He would later say that the reason that he had these bouts of melancholy and depression was because he had Saturn conjunct his ascendant. And therefore, he was prone to this. And we'll talk about that because he had some interesting conclusions about it. So the key moment is he finds a teacher whose name is John Argyropoulos. This is a fellow who was lecturing on Greek language and literature in Florence. And he was translating Aristotle into Latin. The idea being that this way, anybody who knew Latin, which was the sort of common language of the church and of Europe, would now be able to read Aristotle. And this was an idea that really sparked Ficino's imagination to make these ancient teachings available in a modern language. But he quickly abandoned Aristotle again, and he turned to Plato and decided that he would like this to be his life's work, to bring all this knowledge into the world. And so the same teacher, by the way, was a teacher to Lorenzo de Medici. Some say he was a teacher of Leonardo da Vinci as well, so he was quite influential. And however much Ficino wanted to do this, he didn't have the means. He couldn't sit at home all day and work on translating rare manuscripts. He couldn't even get access to the rare manuscripts. He needed to figure out a way, I'm sure his father felt, to make a living, the usual problem between father and son. And so he started to study medicine at this time, since his father was a doctor. I think it's likely that he did that to kind of get his dad off his back. And 3 years later, it's 1462. He's now age 29, and he's in his Saturn return, which he thinks is significant. And now everything magically changes. And so in his spare time, he was able to get some manuscripts related to the hymns of Orpheus, and he began to translate them. And in frustration with being unable to live the life he wanted, he decided to celebrate an Orphic ritual, just he himself, as a way of asking the universe to help him. And so while he was singing the hymn to the cosmos, as he named it, his father brought him a letter from Cosimo. And Cosimo wrote, quote, "Yesterday I arrived at my Careggi estate to cultivate not this place, but my mind. Join us, Marsilio, as soon as you can. Bring Plato's book on the highest good." He's talking about Plato's Philebus, "which I expect you have translated from Greek to Latin as you said you would. What I want with all my heart is to know which way leads most certainly to happiness. Farewell, join us, and bring your Orphic lyre," end quote. Now that "soon as you can" was ominous because Cosmo's health was really beginning to fail, and he was preoccupied now with mortality. So Ficino was astonished by this, and he wrote back that this serendipity of singing this hymn and getting the letter from Cosmo at the same time, it was something that changed his whole perspective on the world. And he wrote back and said, "This has evoked in me the most immense wonder." And he included the hymn that he'd been singing at the time. Would you like to hear it?
Yes.
So this is an English translation of Ficino. He said, this is what he was singing when the message from Cosimo arrived. "O heavens, creator of everything, invincibility of the cosmos, revered ancient origin, beginning and end of all. O cosmos, father who shines light on the sphere of earth as it orbits, turning and circling, house of the blessed. Universe, celestial and earthly, you guard and keep all of us, encircling everything. You hold in your heart all-powerful necessity. Nature, red-eyed, untamed, taking many forms, diversifying the world. Omnipotent Father of time, most excellent and blessed Spirit, Cosmos, hear our prayers and give a quiet life to a sincere youth. End quote. And so, this is what he's saying when he gets the letter saying, come to Careggi and I'm going to give you this life. Pretty amazing moment. So he goes to Careggi and discovers that the villa that Cosimo is staying in is now going to be his. And that Cosimo has given him a village, like a farm and a few buildings, so that they can provide him with what he needs while he takes this incredible work of translation on. And most importantly, Cosimo gives Ficino the manuscripts, all the Plato that they were able to get, a collection of Hellenistic documents that was founded by Leonardo da Pistoia that we now call the Hermetica. And he was so into that, by the way, that he said to Ficino, you know what, wait on Plato and let's get this Hermetic stuff translated, because my understanding is that this is even more outstanding and it predates Plato. And so Ficino, he did read Cosimo parts of his first translation of the Philebus, which is a dialogue that examines the view that pleasure is the highest good. But then we have to define what pleasure is. And this is the fascinating thing that Plato does by trying to delineate all the different ways that pleasure can be defined and deciding which is the best choice. Well, Cosimo was so impressed by this that he decided to reopen Plato's ancient academy in Florence, in Ficino's house in Careggi. And this house, in my opinion, could be called the cradle of the Renaissance. And the many great artists and poets of the Renaissance who came there, many became members of the Academy. And they witnessed Ficino performing the hymns of Orpheus on his lyra di braccio, a recent Italian invention earlier than the violin. This was an interesting instrument. It was like a violin. It had 5 strings tuned like a violin, but it had a low D bottom and 2 drone strings tuned to octave of each other. And Ficino even had a painting of Orpheus on his instrument. The lyra di braccio, some people call it braccio, was played with a bow like a violin. And so it had this kind of plaintive sound to it. And later, Ficino would say that there was no magic more powerful than the Orphic Hymns. And his friends all nicknamed him Orpheus because his playing and his singing and these lyrics were just so beautiful. And the poet Naldi even said that he considered Ficino to be the reincarnation of Orpheus. So by 1463, Ficino completes his translation of the Hermetica, and he's reading it to Cosimo, and he immerses himself now in the work of translating Plato. He's hurrying, trying to finish as much as he can before Cosimo dies. And he's reading these translations to Cosimo while Cosimo is lying in his deathbed. And so I just think it's such a moving kind of moment, and he does not complete it. Unfortunately, Cosimo dies about a year later in August in Careggi, right there in that house. And he did not live to see the complete translation, but he did get a lot of it. So he'd also been asked to translate Dante's Monarchia. This is a book that I think Elon Musk must have read, because in it, Dante defends the idea that there should be one monarch to rule the whole world. And a crisis followed. Ficino said about his crisis. He said, I was stuck because I was so attracted to paganism and so committed to Christianity. And I felt torn between these 2 spiritual paths. And I had to decide, I felt, on one or the other. But I wonder if perhaps Dante's justification for autocrats, because, the Medicis were autocrats despite their generosity. And here he's reading about this, one autocrat to rule the world. And I think Ficino, who was deeply educated in Plato's ideas about that not being a good idea, the philosopher king, okay, but one dictatorial ruler, not a good thing. And I think that he kind of felt, wow, am I really supporting something here that I don't want to support? And it slowed him down. It brought him into bouts of melancholy. And then in 1469, he finally finishes the entire Plato translation. And coincidentally, that same year, he has his translation of the famous Divine Pomander, some people call it Pymander, published in Venice. This is like the great classic of the Hermetica. And he, you would think, would be pleased by this important, achievement. I mean, he's restored this incredible classic of mysticism. They believed this was the actual teaching of Hermes, this great Egyptian teacher who predated Plato. And you'd think that he would have some sense of pride and stability from this, but the crisis actually was only beginning. And it starts when around 1470, Lorenzo de' Medici, he replicates his grandfather Cosimo's patronage of Ficino by bringing this guy Poliziano into his house as tutor to his children. And one of these kids is Giovanni, who's the future Pope Leo X. Poliziano became a lecturer at Ficino's Platonic Academy and a dear friend of Ficino's. In 1480, Poliziano would write this piece called Orfeo, which was a short dramatic composition with music for a carnival, and staging was done by Leonardo da Vinci. It told the tragic love story of Orpheus and Eurydice, which we've talked about in another of these, and he used slang. He used the language of the people to translate the story so that the common people, as they call them, would be able to understand this story. And that was considered revolutionary, and a lot of people did not approve of this, about using common language in that kind of a theatrical setting, and even worse, to introduce pagan ideas. So Poliziano leaves us a brief statement about Ficino's enthusiasm and the effect that his performances of the hymns of Orpheus had. He wrote, "His wise lyre chases away grave thoughts, and his voice follows the song springing up from under his expressive fingers like Orpheus, interpreter of Apollo's songs. When he is finished, drawn on by the passion of the muses, I go home to write my own verses," end quote. But Ficino never published his translation of the hymns because he was in a vulnerable position. As we'll see, this all caught up to him. He only allowed the manuscript to be shared among his friends. So the Academy was known. The church knew that this thing was going on. They were keeping an eye on it. They knew Ficino was doing the hymns of Orpheus. But what was he really doing? And he seemed to be reviving a pagan religion. And this remains a question among academics. Was he really trying to, get these Greek deities to manifest in some way? And I really love, there's a scholar named Angela Voss who's written a lot of amazing material about Ficino. I highly recommend her. And she, among other things, wrote that he saw Orpheus in his hymns addressing the gods as multifaceted, multi-layered cosmic principles, each one mirroring the diversity of creation, yet all representing aspects of a single undivided power, all the gods in each god and each in all, end quote. So it's as if the great God of Christianity, that the different facets of this God, the different powers of this God, the different ways that this God is manifested in different cultures, were all in these hymns. And these hymns were really only to one God, in a sense, but we're describing this God's qualities, which were diverse. She also said that she did not believe that he sang the hymns to intentionally invoke spirits or to get a god to manifest. The object was to tune himself like a string on a lyre until his spirit would resonate in unison with the divine. And so playing music which specifically corresponded to, let's say, Venus or Jupiter or the sun, all these things he describes in his Book of Life, he called it. This would transform the magician into the perfect medium for the divine presence. And then through that presence, there would be an immediate, intuitive sense that is innate to the soul of a light that is infused by God. So it was more that he saw in this tremendous mystical path, and he saw in it so much in common with Christianity. So much so, and perhaps also to get the church maybe a little bit off his back, because they were beginning to be a little concerned about what he was doing. He had himself ordained as a priest in 1473. He also began exchanging letters again with Lorenzo de' Medici, who he'd kind of lost touch with, who was now ruler of Florence. And the academy was doing great. He sat down to write a book called The Christian Religion. And perhaps this also was to defend himself from the Inquisition. And he's looking for a way to combine the wisdom of the ancient world with the wisdom of the church. And he thought that Hermes, Plato, and the Neoplatonists had attained what he called the divine light of the Christians. So there was no difference between the enlightenment that you could get through Christianity and the enlightenment that you could get through Hermes or Plato. It's also interesting that he coined the phrase Platonic love, first in a letter that he wrote in 1476 to a friend, and then 16 years later in 1492, a selection of his letters were published. And this included letters that were written to his colleague and a very dear friend, the poet Giovanni Cavalcanti, in which Ficino explained Platonic love as we know it today. And some scholars have argued that Ficino and Cavalcanti were lovers and that Ficino must have been gay. Maybe, I mean, we don't really know. There's very little evidence of it in his letters. He actually says in his commentary on Plato's Republic that anytime Plato talks about homosexuality in the dialogues, that these are jokes, as he says, spoken merely to relieve the feeling of heaviness. Or as we might say it, it was just bros bantering with each other, kidding each other. So it's kind of an odd thing, but it's so hard to tell because he's always got the church looking over his shoulder. And so maybe even if he was gay, he would not have been overt about it, even in his letters, for fear that would get him into even more trouble. He was famous for his wit. He was very pleasant to be around. People said he was very charming. He tried to hide his intense melancholy from his friends. Sometimes it was so bad, it would reduce him to just sitting dejected and staring. And he said it was because, as mentioned earlier, it was Saturn rising conjunct his ascendant. And he said that people who have heavy Saturn placements in their charts, so if you have a heavy Saturn placement, this may apply to you. He said that you really need to focus on divine wisdom, because that's what Saturn requires of you. And then he said, quote, Saturn is hostile to those people who are living publicly and who have ordinary lives, even if they flee the company of the crowd. But if they do not lay aside ordinary emotions, let's say about current events and such, then they will suffer, because Saturn does not want them to be thinking about day-to-day life and about the normal problems of living a so-called ordinary life. And Saturn wants them to be present for divine wisdom and sharing that divine wisdom into the world. So it's an interesting perspective that he has there. And most of his work was based heavily on astrology. And yet, in 1477, he wrote a book, which he never published, that would seem to reject astrology. But it's a complex position he takes. Some people have used it to say astrology is BS. Even Ficino said so, but he doesn't outright dismiss it. He believes that using astrology to pin down aspects of fate, to say, for example, that this aspect means only this. So if you have this aspect, this is going to happen to you. You'll die this way, or you'll have this kind of relationship. You're actually seeing a lot of this right now from astrologers concerned about the election and these kind of hard predictions of exactly what's going to happen. He didn't think that that was very helpful. He said that astrology is not about the planets making us do things. It's about synchronicity. And I think he probably learned this from Plotinus, who talks about how astrology is an art of signs, of, as he puts it, everything breathes together. So everywhere we look, there are omens because everything is reflecting the moment back at us. And so he's also pointed out that God can change a man's fate through providence and that people have choices to make. The planets indicate situations and maybe even can advise you about what a good choice might be, but you have that choice and you are not compelled to act in a certain way. He thought that astrology should lift us and give us a way to share divine vision, because the divine vision can see the greater harmony and wisdom that is everywhere in the world. And we forget that. And astrology that forgets that and winds up just trying to help people find things they lost, or is this a good relationship? He didn't think those were very useful. And just as an aside, I've had so many astrologers look at the charts for Tamra, my wife and I, and just say, oh my God, you guys, how do you guys get along? And we have got along from the day we met and had a great time. But most astrologers looking at our positions think that we should not be married at all, because how could it possibly be anything but a constant battle? And it's nothing like that. So I tend to believe with him that it's too much of a temptation to use astrology to try to act as though you have the inside information on what's going to happen next, no matter what, when in fact I think it's more a way of giving you perspective and giving you choices and trying to lift up. And that's how he saw it. But many people, having found out about this book, thought, well, clearly he understood then that astrology isn't true. But that isn't the case. And he continued to use astrology even after he wrote and didn't publish that book. And he didn't publish it, which tells you something.
Well, what was the church's attitude towards astrology at this time?
The church was funny, they actually tolerated a certain amount of astrology and magic amongst the priests. There were bishops, cardinals, and such who were interested in these matters. And yet it was supposed to be kind of a hobby, or even more so, sometimes it was said, this is for the elite. Like the bishop has the spiritual knowledge and the intellect to read this stuff, but you don't want to give this to your neighbor. That's going to screw everything up. So it was kept as kind of this, what do I want to call it, like a fantastic delicacy for those who were intelligent enough to appreciate it. But it would be dangerous in the hands of the average person, is how they saw it. But they became much stricter about this, as we'll see, during this 100 years that passes between the birth of Ficino and the death of Paracelsus. All that we're going to talk about happens within this 100-year period that establishes really the Western esoteric tradition. So you mentioned Pico, and in 1484, this was a big year for Ficino because, one, it was his second Saturn return, and he thought this was highly significant. He published his Plato translation.
So many viewers will not know what a Saturn return is. So let's define that term. I know Saturn has a 28-year revolution around the sun.
Yes, it's a period when Saturn returns to where it was when you were born. Mm-hmm. And generally speaking, it's thought to be a very difficult time, a time when you realize that you're no longer young, or that you have to change what you're doing in order to adapt to who you really are becoming. And it can be a time of great disappointment. So you can see in Ficino's life, it was quite the opposite. The first Saturn return brought him Cosimo and the opportunity to go live in Careggi and have this time to do all these translations. The second one brings Pico into his life. And it also happened to occur at a time when Jupiter was conjunct Saturn. This is called the Great Conjunction. It's supposed to define 20-year cycles in society. And Ficino deliberately published his Plato on this Great Conjunction. And on the very day of the Great Conjunction, the very day that he publishes this book, Pico Della Mirandola enters his life. Pico, it turns out, was also born with Saturn in Aquarius, and about 30 years after Ficino was born. And he was going through his first Saturn return when he met Ficino. And he convinces Ficino to turn his attention to translating the great Neoplatonists, beginning with Plotinus. And this is something that Cosimo had wanted him to do. So in 1486, Ficino is so involved in these translations that he's actually lecturing publicly on Plotinus, which is a very courageous act. I mean, he's lecturing on a pagan philosopher not too far from Rome, the seat of the Vatican, and yet nothing happened. It was tolerated. Florence was seen as this kind of hotbed of new ideas and of the resurrection of ancient wisdom, and for whatever reason, the church seemed to be interested in seeing how this was going to develop. And Ficino was also, I think one of the reasons that they allowed him to do this was because he was very interested in healing and in medicine. He believed that the hymns of Orpheus, for example, could heal you from psychological and even physical ailments. And his friends often said that he would heal them through performing hymns. And so he actually wrote that Apollo has vital rays that bestow health and life on all and drives away disease. And by the sounding of the strings, their vibrations and their power, everything is regulated. And he says that the low strings that Apollo strums brings winter, the high strings bring summer, and the middle strings bring spring and autumn, but that these strings also exist within us. And so we can harmonize to the seasons, and we can harmonize to the gods and to the heavenly spirit. And this heavenly spirit penetrates everything, either in secret ways or in obvious ways. And it shows us this this kind of transfer of spirit into the rays of the sun, into the rays of the planets, into everything that exists. And by using these correspondences, by recognizing them, we can heal. We can use song and light and perfumes appropriate to a specific deity. And just like in the use of the hymns, we can consecrate ourselves to the service of that divine harmony. And I think the church was interested in the alchemical dimensions of this healing process, and perhaps they could use the Christian liturgy in ways that reflected the way that Ficino was experimenting with this unusual form of healing. And so his translations of Plotinus, Porphyry, Proclus, and the other key writers of Neoplatonism kept him busy for about 8 years. In 1492, his translation of Iamblichus's on the Egyptian mysteries was released. And I think that was too much for the church, because here we're really going into the heart of theurgy, the practice of lifting yourself to the gods, the heart of pagan magic. And he also published the same year a book called 3 Books of Life, which we'll see was a big influence on Agrippa and even on Paracelsus. And this book was filled with overt magic and mysticism based on experience. Well, boom, that year, 1489, he is accused of being a heretic by the church. And this is a very serious accusation, because Giordano Bruno would be burned at the stake only 11 years later on similar charges. The only reason that Ficino didn't suffer that kind of fate, or at least that he wasn't forbidden for ever dealing with these topics again, was because the Archbishop of Florence stepped in, and knowing what a great treasure he was to Florence, he blocked the effort to punish Ficino. But unfortunately, this was only a foreshadowing of what came next, because there were really dark times just ahead for Florence and for Ficino. So let's talk about the biggest mistake that Lorenzo de' Medici made in his entire life, probably, which was in 1490. It all begins when Pico della Mirandola attends a debate where he hears a priest by the name of Savonarola, who really impresses him because Savonarola knows Aristotle and the Neoplatonists very well. He's also a sincere ascetic and a very earnest prophet. And Savonarola had been basically wandering as a poor itinerant preacher, calling for reforms in northern Italy. He would go to monasteries and convents and small towns. And Pico thought, this might be a solution to one of my problems, which was, this was his ulterior motive for bringing Savonarola to the larger world. Pico was in trouble for a book that he had just written called The 900 Theses, a book that tried to convince its Christian readers that the only way to really save their souls was to study ancient wisdom. And he, for instance, wrote in this book that the names of the gods that Orpheus sings are not the names of deceiving demons from whom evil and not good comes, but of natural and divine powers distributed in the world by the true God for the great utility of man if he knows how to use them, unquote. Well, this book was the first book that the Catholic Church gave a universal ban to. Usually they would do these limited bans so the public couldn't get it. Or no, this book was to be burned wherever it was found and was to never be printed. And Pico was in a lot of trouble for having written it. So it seems that Pico thought, I'm going to go to Lorenzo and say, why don't we bring Savonarola to Florence? He'll be my spiritual advisor. He can be your spiritual advisor. Everybody will gain in prestige because Savonarola was being looked at as this very dedicated Christian. And so Savonarola comes to Florence. Well, that turned out to be a disaster. This man preached against hereditary tyrants. Hello, Medicis. He preached against corruption in the church, against injustice committed against the poor, and he was preaching against the worldliness of society. And Florence was a worldly place. There was a lot of flirtation and extramarital sex and intoxication. And he also, Savonarola, was very opposed to all non-religious art. So all that gorgeous secular art that was being made, he saw it as a distraction, and he believed that God brought him to Florence to put an end to the Renaissance. And that meant ending the heresies of Ficino, ending the Platonic Academy, making sure that Poliziano didn't do his Orfeo, and he wanted to burn Botticelli's Birth of Venus. It was pagan as well as being secular. And he was also prophesying. And some of his small prophecies seemed to come true, so the people of Florence noticed. And then he had this dramatic vision of a Florence cleansed of the sins of the Renaissance that would be all the more, incredible. Its destiny would be great because it gave up its sinfulness. And people were very interested in that prophecy. So Ficino, who's now just about to turn 60, he's looking at all this. He's not too concerned. He's lived his whole life pretty much safe, even though the church came after him. The archbishop protected him. And so he writes this statement. He says, "This age, like a golden age, has brought back to light those liberal disciplines that were practically extinguished: grammar, poetry, oratory, painting, sculpture, architecture, music, and the ancient singing of songs to the Orphic lyre." But wow, he was really wrong about what was about to happen, because all of that was about to be wiped. And so this was 1494 now. This is a bad year for Ficino. The people of Florence begin to turn against the Medicis in a very significant way. Even worse, Ficino loses two of his best friends, Pico and Poliziano. And it's rumored that Pico was poisoned for bringing Savonarola to Florence. And there were also rumors that Pico and Poliziano were lovers, and that might have been one of the reasons that they were perhaps assassinated. In the fall of that year, 1494, King Charles of France invades Italy. And this was part of the prophecy. people thought that Savonarola was, he's on it. He's seeing the will of God. And so they quickly exiled the Medicis, which put Ficino into a terrible position. These people who supported him his whole life were suddenly powerless in Florence, and he was like a sore thumb with all his paganism in the midst of this Christian revivalist movement that Savonarola had engineered. And meanwhile, Savonarola has gone to Charles, literally goes to Charles to negotiate. And Charles says, okay, we're going to give you control over Florence. Bad situation for the Platonic Academy. Well, the citizens joined Savonarola in this mission to rid the city of its sinful behavior. So now there is constant pressure on the politicians coming from Savonarola to pass new laws. They're banning sexy attire. They're banning adultery. They're banning drunkenness in public. They're banning homosexuality. And young men and older boys are recruited to patrol the streets of Florence looking for banned behavior and forbidden fashion to punish. Just think about that. This is a city where Botticelli was painting this amazing Birth of Venus, and there was Orpheus was being performed in the language of the people, and people were being healed by the Orphic hymns being performed at the Platonic Academy, and all of a sudden there's these young men walking around punishing people because their ankles are showing. So all this convinced Savonarola that he was doing God's will, and he really missed one very startling fact, which was that Pope Alexander VI, the Pope at that time, was a Borgia. He was Rodrigo Borgia. And if you know anything about the Borgias, they were not to be messed with. And this was probably the most corrupt pope in the history of popes. So he was not going to take any of this sitting down. In 1495, he convenes the Holy League to fight the French. And he tells Florence, you must send troops, which puts Savonarola in a bad position because he has got a deal with Charles to rule Florence. So he refuses to send troops. So the Pope says, you come to Rome right now. I need to talk to you. Well, Savonarola refuses to obey this order from the Pope. So the Pope punishes him. No preaching. You are not allowed to preach anymore. Savonarola doesn't care. He keeps preaching. In fact, he whips up the support of the people with these dramatic fire, torch processions. And he has bonfires of the vanities, he called it. This is where paintings, ostentatious furniture and clothes, and books, including the books of Ficino, were burned in public ceremonies. Now, we don't even know what masterpieces were lost. All sorts of things burned and were never to be seen again. Well, the Pope's reaction to this was to excommunicate Savonarola in 1497. And that was powerful because the people now, if they followed him, they were all excommunicated in a sense. By being excommunicated, he no longer had the power to hear confession or to forgive or to bless. And everybody following him was now a heretic. And so all of a sudden the people turned on Savonarola and two of his principal supporters. They imprisoned him, and the two supporters, they tortured them, and they were judged guilty. And in the spring of 1498, the powers of government in Florence and of the church united, and they did a public hanging and hung all three of them and then burned their bodies in the plaza, the great plaza of Florence. So Ficino lived long enough to see that happen, but he did die the following year. And it was the Renaissance in Florence never really recovered. However, the Renaissance that you could say Ficino started with those translations would exist for another 150 years as it spread through the rest of Europe. And there were these flowerings of amazing artistic creativity and religious thought. And in a way, the Rosicrucians even emerged from that, as we'll see, from the influence of Paracelsus. And so before we move on, I want to leave with two gems of wisdom from Ficino that I think really tell us about him. One was something he wrote in a letter to his dearest friend. He said, "A long time ago, I learned from Orpheus that love existed and that it held the keys to the whole world." And then he said, "The whole power of magic consists in love." Now, I wonder if this kind of came from that experience of doing this hymn in desperation and then having his wishes granted even while he was doing the hymn. And he felt this was love, the love of the universe had shown itself to him through the hymns of Orpheus. And he believed that this love, loving his friends, loving the creation, loving the gods, that this was the key to everything in life. So it's ironic that at the end, Savonarola, who was supposed to be representing the Prince of Peace and Love, spread so much hate in Florence that families were turning against each other. And it's almost a miracle to me that Ficino didn't get in more trouble, that didn't get executed or himself burned, that except for that time when the church came after him as a heretic, he basically was able to live his life unmolested, doing things that no one could imagine the church having any approval for. So that's Ficino. He's the one who starts this whole process out for us of the Renaissance and sends out into the world his own writings, his writings about alchemy and medicine and about astrology and about the gods, and his translations of Plato and the Neoplatonists and the Hermetica. All of a sudden there's this wealth of information that's out there. And I should mention that it's very interesting because all of that kind of starts because even before he was born in Florence, there was a small renaissance of interest in Aristotle and Lucretius and in these pagan ideas. And there was a conference that the church had in Florence when I think Ficino was like 6 years old or something, that all these thinkers from Germany and France and from all around Europe came to this. And they met these Florentine scholars who started talking to them about Aristotle and these beliefs. And they were all excited about it. They went home and they started to read these materials themselves. And that created an environment where once Ficino released these materials, there were already thinkers out there around the world of Europe who were eager to get their hands on what Plato really had to say. So now we're going to move on to Agrippa.
Okay.
Heinrich Cornelius, better known as Agrippa, a name he chose himself, and he chose it because the Roman Agrippa was the founder of the city in which the Agrippa we are talking about was born in 1486. He is born in Cologne, Germany. And 200 years earlier, Cologne happened to be the home of Albertus Magnus, Albert the Great, who was a brilliant thinker of the medieval era, bishop and occultist and an early scientist, and was an inspiration. At the age of 13, Agrippa was already studying Albertus Magnus, and he was 13 when Ficino died, Agrippa. He didn't know about Ficino yet. But he, in studying Albertus Magnus, was in a sense preparing himself, and later he would be greatly influenced by Ficino. Agrippa had a strange life. He worked for royalty, so he lived very well, but he also went to prison for debt. And he was the court secretary for Charles V, King of France. He was personal physician for Louise of Savoy, who was a French duchess and who she became the queen mother of France. But he was also persecuted and censored and had a lot of difficulty and conflict in his life. He starts out in history as a soldier. He became a diplomat, a faith healer, a scholar, a lawyer, but he's best known for writing what is probably the most plagiarized work in the Western esoteric tradition, which is the occult philosophy in 3 books. And that was a title and a structure that was inspired by Ficino's 3 books of life. In 1508, we find Agrippa at the age of 24 traveling to Spain and then Italy as a mercenary. He was obviously good at it because he rose to become a captain in the army of the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian. And he earned a knighthood. He wrote about these experiences in a letter. He said, "My right hand soaked in blood, my left dividing spoil, my belly filled with prey, and the way of my feet was over corpses of the slain." So he had some pride about his skills as a warrior and his ability to deal with the goriness of that world. But that was not the only conflict that he experienced. He would be condemned multiple times. For instance, the Portuguese Inquisition went after him, and they wrote a report on the occult philosophy, and they described him as, quote, "the most condemned heretic of the first class." And the priest also was of the opinion that because Agrippa was so skeptical about everything, he must be a Lutheran. But Agrippa, while he admired Luther, he really wasn't a Lutheran or a Protestant. He believed in the rituals of the Catholic Church, which to him were comparable to the Orphic Hymns and other ancient mysteries. And to him, a pure-hearted magician performing a ritual was just as good as a priest doing the liturgy. And he suggested that magicians put together their own hymns to the gods of their choice. And he suggested the best model for that process could be found in the Orphic Hymns. But you didn't have to be limited to the Orphic Hymns. You could do your own. And he was very focused on musical magic because of the mathematics under it and the influence of Ficino. People thought this had to do with the devil, but really he was getting these ideas from Orpheus and from Pythagoras and seeing them through the lens of Neoplatonism. So maybe one of the better times in his life was in 1509 when he becomes a university lecturer. And Margaret of Austria, the Duchess of Savoy, she had become the governor of the Habsburg Netherlands, and she became his patroness. She was a really skilled diplomat, very good at managing the economy, and very encouraging to culture. And he made this good impression by showing up in her town, her city, and lecturing at the local university on the subject of this book that was called The Miracle Making Word by a guy named Reuchlin. And Reuchlin was sort of an expert on the Kabbalah at that time. And like Ficino, he was a student of John Argyropoulos, that translator of Aristotle. And during that time, Agrippa wrote a book called On the Nobility and Excellence of the Feminine Sex, in which he used Kabbalistic concepts to allegedly prove the superiority of women. He probably did this to please Margaret, and he dedicated it to her. But scholars say that, it's a little ironic. There seems to be some sarcasm in the book. Like, you're not really sure where he's being sincere and where he's kind of saying these things in the way that, let's say, Petronius used to compliment Nero, where every compliment was an insult. He was given, however, a doctorate in theology. And then all of a sudden a cleric accused him, and I quote, of being a Judaizing heretic, because he was talking about the Kabbalah, and the Kabbalah is Jewish. He had to leave town. So he went back to Germany, where he studied with what he considered his greatest master, who was a German Benedictine abbot by the name of Trithemius. And some people call him Trithemius. And Eliphas Levi, the great writer on magic, in his History of Magic, had something to say about this. He said, Trithemius is in magic the master of masters, and we have no hesitation in proclaiming him the most wise and learned of adepts. So Levi, who was this very influential magus in Paris years later, a century or two later, he was born during Emperor Napoleon's reign, and he died at the end of Napoleon III's empire. And we're going to come back to him because he had some very interesting things to say about Agrippa and Paracelsus.
He's the author of Transcendental Magic.
Exactly. And we talked about him quite a bit in our last talk. Yes. And so Trithemius had access to a collection of medieval magical manuscripts that he quotes from a lot. And it was the only place that you could read anything from these manuscripts for something like 500 years. He was said to have drawn spirits into crystals, but this was not sinister demonic magic or, even New Age crystal worship. This was kind of similar to the pagan tradition of asking the gods they used to call it to jump into the harvest, to jump into a weapon, or to jump into the next generation to make them fertile and creative and brilliant and good fighters. And so in this way, he would invite this divine energy into the crystal, invoke it into the crystal, and then that crystal would be there as a source of this fertility, abundance, of positive energy, if you will. He wrote a manuscript in 1499 that started to circulate in Europe that would not be published for over 100 years. And it's pretty much based on the Kabbalah. He argues that there's a code that exists in all of nature that allows human beings to communicate with spirits and angels. And he believed that there was an angelic language, and that the Kabbalah was the key to understanding this angelic language that could be read throughout nature. And I think this is probably at least one of the main sources for John Dee's obsession with communicating with the Enochian angels. And I think that there's a whole thread of scrying and of attempts at communication with the higher echelons of the Catholic Church's vision of angelic qualities that kind of starts with this book that Trithemius wrote. And Agrippa brought his manuscript for the occult philosophy to Trithemius, who thought it was good and encouraged him to finish it and publish it. But both of these tasks took a really long time. And it's said that Agrippa only finished the occult philosophy when his friends said, look, we're going to publish this in as-is condition if you don't finish it. We don't even care about your consent. We think it's that important. And realizing that this incomplete version would be published, Agrippa then decided to really try and finish this book. And he even dedicated it to Trithemius. And by the way, some occult writers believe that Paracelsus was also Trithemius' student. But more recent research shows us that Paracelsus arrived at the place where Trithemius taught after Trithemius' death. So by 1511, Agrippa is back in the service of the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian. He's a diplomat. And a year later, he's as a doctor of theology, he's present for the Schismatic Council of Pisa. And that brings him to Italy, where he begins to practice medicine, and he's teaching theology. He's in this town that gets hit with the plague. They ask him to cure it. The local doctors hate him, and they treat him with scorn and ridicule because he's taking these approaches that have more to do with Ficino than they have to do with the beliefs of the medicine at that time. And he does a deep dive at that point into Ficino and into the writings of Pico. And in Pico's Christian Kabbalah, he finds something that just revolutionizes his understanding of the occult. By the way, Pico also would write a book, 12 books, but it was one work against astrology, something that he had been really into and had written in defense of. And Agrippa didn't seem to care much about that, but he did get an idea, apparently, from this, which is that he believed that Pico wasn't really writing against astrology. He believed that Pico was trying to protect himself from the church, and that the book was written in this ironic kind of way. And as we'll see, this is what Agrippa started to do as well. We may have already seen a glimpse of it in his book about how wonderful the female sex is, but it becomes even more obvious. So in 1528, he's invited to participate in the arguments for the legality of Henry VIII's divorce from Catherine of Aragon, but he's smart enough to stay away from that, and he gets a better offer from Margaret, which is to become the archivist and historian for the Holy Roman Emperor Charles. That's a nice gig for him, but it only lasts 2 years because then Margaret dies. And now all of a sudden, Agrippa has no support at all. And his books are now being published by his friends, so he now has enemies, old enemies who attacked him earlier about his beliefs, and now there's books that they can attack. He even gets imprisoned for debt during this period. The Inquisition moves to stop the printing of the occult philosophy, and he gets arrested in France because he allegedly insulted the Queen Mother in print, which he denied, but something that he said was kind of taken out of context. And because he wrote in these sort of in a way that had potential different meanings in it, people thought that he was really insulting this revered woman. This is when one of the most bitter turns. I mean, you think it was bad enough. He gets arrested for that. He's in prison for debt and all the rest. But something even worse happened in 1559 when the fourth book of occult philosophy, as it was called, was published. And this was claiming to be the fourth and final volume of the occult philosophy. It was a book of Goetia, spells, necromancy, demonology, a lot of satanic kind of stuff. Everybody seemed to think, well, there it is. I mean, Agrippa really is a Satan worshiper, and this is the proof. But Agrippa didn't write it. And he had students who spent years telling people that is not Agrippa. He did not write that book, but it was always released under his name. And eventually, in the 1700s, a couple hundred years later, in France, there are these notorious books that come out about conjuring spirits and seeking treasures in occult ways, getting revenge. And they became really popular. They were like these little pamphlets. And they were called Agrippa Noir, Black Agrippa, which kind of meant the black arts of Agrippa. And possessing these books could lead to serious trouble with the authorities. In 1572, a book was published called On the Art of Alchemy. And this is going to show us this powerful connection between Ficino and Agrippa. The book was the most important book on the subject published at that point. It was published anonymously. And the ideas in it are based on alchemical theories in the third chapter of Ficino's 3 Books of Life. The idea is that the philosopher's stone, the elixir, the universal medicine, can be found in the world soul that is buried deep in gold. Because the world soul exists in everything that exists in the world. And it's in an especially pure form in gold, which was considered one of the purest and most divine substances. This made the book very important and also caused people to attribute it to Ficino. But modern scholars have gone in there, studied the language, studied the references, and they came out saying, wow, this book was written by Agrippa, because this is all Agrippa's interests and Agrippa's terminology and such. He's basing it on Ficino. He's running with it. He's taking it further than Ficino did, but this is not Ficino. And so here we have this hugely influential book on alchemy, actually by Agrippa, but credited to Ficino. That's how big the influence was. The philosophy of the occult in 3 books represented the 3 areas of magic practiced by human beings, which were natural, celestial, and ceremonial. This reflected the universe, which is divided into the elements, the celestial, and the intellectual. The 4 elements have this threefold nature in them, and the 4 elements are in all things in different proportions, from the lowest things to the highest. And they have virtues, which are both natural and occult, or secret. The natural are the virtues of the elements, the heat of fire, the life-giving properties of water, the fertility of the soil, and so on. Agrippa tells us the occult virtues, which he calls occult qualities, that these are very hard to find, and that man's intellect cannot in any way reach them. You have to use higher faculties to understand them. And I want to make sure to add here, because I think this is amazing, that Agrippa is the one who first used the word occult in the way that we use it today. Because occult used to just mean secret. But occult was used by Agrippa specifically about what we now call the Western esoteric tradition and what he called natural magic, natural philosophy. Many people called it that. So he coined the use of occult in you talking about these matters. And he said that every occult property is conveyed into herbs, stones, metals, animals, by way of the sun, the moon, and the planets, and through the stars that are higher than the planets. And that by understanding these virtues everywhere in the world, we come into the ability to be involved with natural magic. So celestial magic is the knowledge and use of the occult virtues of mathematics, the symbols of the cycles and multitudes of nature and the planets. And by understanding these things, we perfect our world and ourselves. And he considered ceremonial magic the highest of these high arts. He said it could bring the magician into union with the divine, which meant achieving the full potential possible for a human being. So at this point, he's a contentious character, but he's very influential. The book is very influential. And he writes something called Of the Vanity and Uncertainty of Arts and Sciences. He writes it in 1526 and he publishes it in 1530. And in it, Agrippa admits feeling remorse about the time he wasted on the occult. He says, in fact, that all the arts and sciences should be thrown into the bonfire of the vanities, his bonfire of the vanities, along with magic, because he thinks that they're all basically human BS, just we use in order to gain status and such, and that if you really examine the words and the ideas, that they fall apart. And he was a very sharp wit, and he punctured many pretenses. But this work is a paradox, because in denying this knowledge, he writes this big book that's filled with all of this information that he's saying is unimportant. And yet he's writing about it in great detail as if it's very important. So some scholars, like Frances Yates, a very eminent but maybe overly enthusiastic English scholar who specialized on Rosicrucianism and on Shakespeare, she thought that Of the Vanity and Uncertainty of Arts and Sciences was kind of Agrippa's get-out-of-jail-free card. If the Inquisition came knocking on his door, he could hand them the book and say, see, look, I regret my time doing this. I even regret my book, The Occult Philosophy. It was a waste of time. I don't think that's a good explanation. As some modern academics have pointed out, if you read this book, he's bitching at the church the whole time. He's telling priests how bad they are. And it's not the kind of book that you would have used to get priests to say, oh, he's okay. Way too critical. So I don't think that that's probably what he was doing there. And also, if you read it carefully, you can see that he's not dismissing magic, actually. He's dismissing all the low forms of magic. He's dismissing using magic to get what you want or to get revenge or all that stuff. He believes that the magic of Ficino is one of the only arts and sciences that isn't vanity. And then a scholar by the name of Eugene Korkowski had this brilliant, I think, insight into Of the Vanity and Uncertainty of Arts and Sciences. He says of it that it's a, quote, masterpiece of ironic, spoofing, satirical wit. So think of it this way. Everything in this book is vanity. Therefore, the book's claim that everything in it is vanity is itself vanity, which means that the things in the book are not vanity. And that's really the feeling you get when you read the book, that he thinks this is all information that you want to know and you should know, but he's going to say it's vanity so that he can be safe, perhaps, on some level. And another scholar suggested a very modern idea that he may have been pointing out how inadequate words are to capturing reality, and that all seekers of knowledge must constantly remind ourselves that words are as misleading as they are helpful. He really understood belief as being a factor in all of this. So he had this description of the use of sacred words in magic where he said the sacred words don't have power in magical operations in themselves. They're just words. But it is because of the faith of the magician. If you believe in it, then these words can become what he called a conduit pipe for the secret power of God. This is then transmitted to us through what he called the ears cleaned by faith and by the invocation of the divine. And that through these influences, you could do wonderful things. So he's basically saying that the magician's magic only works because the magician believes that it's going to work. And that's an idea that is usually considered more modern, but clearly Agrippa understood this. The story goes that Agrippa's enemies finally caught up with him, and he was put behind bars and tortured, and was only released as a broken man, and that he died a few weeks later. And Eliphas Levi went a long way to establishing this narrative in his Mysteries of Magic, where he wrote, the abbot Trithemius lived and died peacefully, while Agrippa, his imprudent disciple, prematurely closed in a hospital his life of disquietude and torment. Before his death, Agrippa blasphemed occult science as Brutus blasphemed virtue at Philippi. But despite the discouragement of Agrippa, occult science is true. So modern scholars tell us that this is probably not what happened. The thing is, we don't know what happened, and we don't know what Levi's source was. Agrippa, disappears from history around 1533, and we have no historical records concerning his later years or his death, and we know nothing about them. His myth, however, kept evolving, like Levi's description of his death. So, for example, they said that Agrippa had this black dog. It was his demonic familiar, and it followed him everywhere. He became the very archetype of the black magician, and people used to tell stories about him. And so, for instance, one of them was Agrippa had a secret room, and he left the key to that room with his wife one day while doing an errand and told her to keep it safe. But she was careless, and she left it out, and one of Agrippa's students found it. And he had been hoping for just such an opportunity to get into that room with all those goodies that he wasn't allowed to see. So he let himself in. In the room, the student finds an old book. He sits down to read. He's reading a ritual for invoking a demon, just reading it. And he looks up and is shocked to find that just reading it has invoked the demon. The demon is standing there and wants to know why it was summoned. The student stammers. He doesn't know. He's dumbfounded. So the demon strangles him. Agrippa comes home, finds the corpse, probably threw a look at his wife, then summoned the same demon and demanded it put life back into the student's body. Sent the poor kid on an errand. The demonic magic wore off as the kid walked in the street. He falls lifeless on the ground, but at least he's not in Agrippa's house when it happened, so there's no suspicion. So that's a typical kind of myth. Absolutely nothing about it that has anything to do with Agrippa's life, but this was the kind of story that started to be told about him. And because of these stories, he becomes a major source for the legend of Faust. Certainly not the only one, but a major influence. There was somebody named Faust who was a man of ill repute. Martin Luther wrote about him. But the Agrippa myths especially informed the literary Fausts, both of Goethe, who read Agrippa, and also the tragical history of Dr. Faustus by the English playwright Christopher Marlowe. And in that play, Marlowe wrote about magic in very precise detail. And his Faustus declares that he, quote, will be as cunning as Agrippa. So that play was a huge influence on Shakespeare's The Tempest. Here's the thing about Agrippa, though. He considered himself a Catholic. The point of his work was to reveal that the mysteries of the ancients were not demonic or ignorant, but they contained the wisdom that could help Christianity achieve its highest potential. This ancient wisdom and the lineage of those who preserved it were divine mysteries They were not lies or heresies or the work of the devil. What did he intend with his 3 books? He said, and more eloquently than I'm going to say it, he said that he wanted to take this tangled mess of mistranslations, of obscure editions, of partial texts and interpolations, and he was trying to disentangle them, to correct them, and to make them accessible. And in doing this, he was really establishing the foundation of Western esoteric tradition, because he was trying to reveal the beautiful, the good, and the true at the heart of the teachings of the Orphic Pythagoreans, the Neoplatonist theurgists, the Kabbalists, and the Hermeticists, and most of all in the writing of Ficino and in the lessons he learned from his teacher, Trithemius. He was assembling this narrative that we call the Western esoteric tradition. And after that, so many books, I mean, obscure books like books written by Alexander Wilder, but Blavatsky, Manly Hall, they have done this. They've repeated this history of the Pythagoreans and Neoplatonists, and this is all part of this one tradition. And Agrippa is really the first one to systematize it. Mm-hmm. Levi had mixed feelings about Agrippa. In his History of Magic, he wrote, Cornelius Agrippa, who was a seeker all his life and attained neither science nor peace. Agrippa's books are full of erudition and audacity. He was himself capricious and independent, so it came about that he passed for a loathsome sorcerer and was persecuted by the priesthood and by princes. In the end, he wrote against the sciences which couldn't bring him happiness, and he died miserable and abandoned. End quote. In a letter to a student, Levi wrote, "You are reading Agrippa and you confess to a certain disappointment? Did you mistake him for a master? He was only a bold vulgarizer, and fortunately very superficial in his studies, never possessing the keys of the Sefer Yetzirah and Zohar, 2 of the most important Kabbalistic works. He was a brave, restless, trifling soul. His work, however, is the first which did something to spread knowledge of these higher sciences. Too shallow for a magus, he was pleased to pass as a magician and a sorcerer. He's accused even of coining false money under the pretext of Hermetic science, and could scarcely do better, being ignorant of the natural philosophy of Hermes. This notwithstanding, his books are useful reading when one knows more and better than he did." End quote. And yet, in his book, Transcendental Magic, Levi says that Agrippa was, quote, illustrious and unfortunate. So he respected him. I mean, to call him illustrious, there was something there that Levi was recognizing. In Agrippa's writing, he refers to a secret key. He says that without this secret key, no one can unlock the truth. The key also protects and keeps the practitioner safe in any and all circumstances. So what might have been the secret key of this allegedly evil master of the dark arts? In academia, the most accepted theory, and I think it's probably true, is that Agrippa's key is faith in Jesus Christ. This tied Agrippa's magical ceremonies to the elaborate rituals and liturgy of the Catholic Church, which he never left. Agrippa's magic is not a religion. He already had his religion. It's a science, and what Eliphas Levi would later call higher science. There's a book called Nature Loves to Hide by Paul S. MacDonald, a wonderful writer. And he describes the intent of the 3rd book of the 3 books on occult philosophy this way: the practice of a rigorously non-superstitious magic, immune to demonic deceptions by a perfected philosopher with supernatural powers. Again, a rather modern idea. I've recently seen, for instance, the teacher Mitch Horowitz saying that what he's trying to teach is practical. It's all results driven. It's a science. It is not faith. So this is an idea that Agrippa was teaching way back then. to be caught with a book by Agrippa in your possession at times in history, even procuring a copy for someone or for yourself, could lead to a death sentence. Books on magic became so popular that in 1573, the Catholic Church ordered the burning of all magic books. But they privately admitted that there was now so many of them that they couldn't burn them all. To give you an example, there was one unfortunate book dealer of Venice, Italy, who the Inquisition drowned for providing copies of the occult philosophy to two clients in other countries. The book had been popular, even though it was controversial and censored, but now it was dangerous in such a tangible way because there was actual executions connected to it that ironically it added to Agrippa's reputation as an evil wizard. So this master of irony, had a very ironic life himself. And ultimately, he would become arguably the most plagiarized author, as I mentioned. For example, Francis Barrett's very influential work in English, The Magus, A Complete System of Occult Philosophy, is really just big chunks of Agrippa, especially the fourth book that wasn't Agrippa at all. But Agrippa is not given credit. It's just simply presented by Barrett. And we still find, even in modern writers, a lot of Agrippa going on. So even though Levi tells us that he was not the top level magus and didn't fully understand the mysteries, his influence was much bigger than Ficino's in a way. Although I would say that Ficino, how I put this, the people that Ficino influenced had more influence, but the books that Ficino wrote did not have the kind of influence that Agrippa did. And that will bring us to Paracelsus. He's really an interesting character. He's the last of this trinity, and he's born in Switzerland in 1493. And he lives most of his life in Germany, considers himself a German. And he travels widely in search of knowledge, talking to the biggest experts of the time, but also he's talking to, crazy old herbalist who's living at the outskirts of the village. He wants to talk to everyone and find out everything he can. One of his most famous sayings was, "He who would read and understand the book of nature must walk its pages with his feet." During his life, he was a town doctor, a university lecturer, a military surgeon. He revolutionized alchemy, medicine, and to some degree, the Western esoteric tradition. He was even a pioneer of positive thinking and the power of belief. Eliphas Levi says in his The Mysteries of Magic, "Are you exposed in a battle? Believe yourself as invincible as Achilles, and you will be," says Paracelsus, end quote. So that idea, which is so common today, think positively, fake it till you make it, that kind of thing, is something that Paracelsus was dealing with. And I actually will tell a personal story here briefly, because I experienced something like this. When I was a kid, growing up with parents who survived a war and were traumatized, they had me caged until I could get to school. And even then, I wasn't allowed to do much interaction with anybody because they didn't trust Americans. So I was living this really weird life. And one of the things that was most important to me was baseball. And I was obsessed with pitching. And while there were good pitchers when I was a kid, the pitcher that really got to me was somebody historically that I thought of as the Achilles of pitching, which was Sandy Koufax. And I read everything I could get about Sandy Koufax. I looked at film and even went so far as to look at microfiche in libraries, trying to look at his technique and see what was this guy doing. And I was just obsessed with it. My parents decided to send me to a summer camp. This was an ethnic summer camp, and they said, "Oh, this will be great for you. You'll be around your own kind, and people will be like family, and they'll all be so kind to you, and it's going to be a great experience." I didn't really want to go, but I went. And one of the traditions at the camp was that in the first week, the junior counselors would ask the kids that were just cabin kids to play a baseball game. of the cabin kids versus the junior counselors. And this was a way to show, look, we're way stronger than you, we're way bigger than you, we're way more capable than you, so you better not cause trouble, because we're going to beat you up in this baseball game, and then you'll know what you're dealing with. And when they chose me, there were going to be 2 pitchers, and I was going to be one of them. The whole camp laughed because I was this scrawny little runt. It was clearly a choice that was made to embarrass everyone, including myself, so that the kids had no choice of winning. But for me, it was a thrill because it was my first chance to pitch, because I wasn't allowed to do Little League or anything like that. And so I got up on the mound, and I thought of all the things I knew about Sandy Koufax, and I thought, I'm Sandy Koufax. I'm as invincible as Sandy Koufax. And I did all his mannerisms, wiping my hand and all this stuff. And I struck out 9 junior counselors, one after the other. They were furious. They were so angry. And the next pitcher up was the younger brother of the person who was the head junior counselor, and they murdered him, home run after home run, until the game was over. I had one friend at the camp, an immigrant kid. I didn't get along with anybody else. And we were walking behind everyone, and he was saying, oh my God, you're going to be, that was amazing. You're going to be a legend. They're going to get you in the Little League. You're going to be a baseball pitcher. How could they not, And I thought, wow, this is amazing. I just struck out 9 junior counselors. Maybe I will be a pitcher. Maybe I do have a future. They were walking in front, talking to each other, and the older brother had his arm around the younger brother, and we were lagging quite a bit behind. We got to the Quonset hut where we would be eating our dinner, and when I walked in, the head of the whole camp looked at me and he said, hey, good one, Ronnie. You gave up 9 home runs? I was stunned, I said, I struck out 9. The whole place just goes into laughter. What a ridiculous idea. What a liar. And my friend says, it's true. I saw it. He struck out 9 of them. And the head of the junior counselor said, hey, when are you 2 going to get married? Everybody laughed again. And that was it. I had not struck out 9. It never happened. I was the idiot who gave up 9 home runs, not his little brother. And I never pitched again. But I did experience what Levi's talking about there. I was confronted with this situation where they wanted me to fail. They wanted to humiliate me. I had studied my version of Achilles for invincibility, and it worked. My belief that I could be as invincible as Sandy Koufax manifested, even though they took that from me. And I've always remembered that as an example of what you can do when you have that belief. And so it's amazing to me that here we have Paracelsus talking about this way back then, about if you have this belief in your invincibility, if you know who Achilles is and you feel like Achilles, and you will be Achilles in battle. It seems awfully advanced for the kind of thinking that was going on in those days.
And we now have many examples of that sort of thing. What comes to mind for me is described in the book Psychic Discoveries Behind the Iron Curtain, published back in 1969, a Bulgarian technique, as I recall, called artificial reincarnation, where people under hypnosis come to believe they're the reincarnation of great musicians or artists from the past and are able to produce works that are of much different quality than they would normally have done.
Isn't that amazing? I think that's amazing. I wish there was so much more study done around those subjects. I knew of in my book, American Metaphysical Religion, I wrote about a famous musician who used to tour in Europe around the turn of the century, and who believed that he was channeling the music of great composers. And he would sit down and say, who do you want me to play? And they would say, Liszt. And he would play something. And one of the famous stories was that a close friend and student of Liszt heard him play and said, my God, that was Liszt. That's how Liszt plays. And so he was not just a musician, he was very into the metaphysical psychic side of things. He also used to dye his mustache orange. So there was an interesting kind of punk rock thing going on there with him. But yeah, it's an amazing human skill that human beings should really, I think, be exploring more. In our personal lives, we can certainly try it out. And I had exciting results. It didn't turn out well ultimately, but I still carry with me that amazing experience of having done that, because you can't take that away. And speaking of amazing, let's talk about some of the accomplishments of Paracelsus. He has been called the father of both pharmacology and toxicology. The whole science of toxicology really began when Paracelsus discovered, as he described it, that only the dose makes the poison. He was the first one to realize that you could use something that was toxic in a limited amount and get healing qualities from it. He was also the first to figure out that certain substances seem to influence certain organs. He had a slogan that was, "The patients are your textbook. The sickbed is your study." And he was the first significant voice, a doctor opposing bloodletting. He said it did more harm than good, and it had no logical basis. He was also the first doctor who was really heard, who advocated keeping wounds clean. I mean, in this era, because unfortunately, the pagans understood that, but all that was lost during the Dark Ages. So along comes Paracelsus, and he says, no, you don't smear dung on a wound, which people were doing. And the infection is not a good part of the healing process. We want to keep these wounds clean, and we want to bandage them, which was thought, he's crazy. People thought that was just ridiculous, but that's how he practiced. And of course, that's what medicine eventually realized. He also invented the use of camphor in liniment, and all liniments since have been at least somewhat based on his recipes. He even recognized the importance of fasting in healing. He wrote, "Fasting is the greatest remedy, the physician within." And he recommended taking small doses of iron for what he called poor blood. He's said to have introduced opium to Western Europe and to have created laudanum from it. It wasn't the same kind of laudanum as Shelley used, but a type of it. And these two drugs were like a huge blessing. Mostly we think of them now as kind of drugs that romantic poets used or something. But this was a world without anesthetic, without even aspirin. And so having these painkillers like opium and laudanum was a tremendous gift to give Europe. He anticipated germ theory at a time when most people thought that illness came from demons or vengeful ghosts or sinful thoughts or just God willing it. He advocated for the idea that there were externals that were causing sickness. And he also treated mental illness as a sickness rather than as a spiritual problem or as willful obstinance or possession. He even is credited with coining the words zinc, alcohol, chemistry, and gas. And he correctly intuited that our world, our bodies, are made of the stuff of the stars, of the matter of our sun. I mean, incredible, all of that stuff. And let's talk about his name for a moment, because he gave himself that name. And it means beyond Celsus. Celsus was one of the ancient authorities on medicine. His name was Aulus Cornelius Celsus. He wrote a book about medicine, philosophy, rhetoric, law, the arts of war, and agriculture. His contemporaries didn't notice or care about, but the part about medicine survived and became very influential. Celsus lived during the times of Caesar, Augustus, Tiberius, Nero, Caligula. He survived all that, and he died in 50 AD during the reign of the Emperor Claudius. And his book has some modern ideas, including the necessity of cleanliness. But Paracelsus felt that he was way better than Celsus, so he gave himself that name to immediately communicate to other doctors that he's greater than Celsus was. And that wasn't enough for him. So he even went about burning books by ancient masters of the art like Galen publicly to say, medicine today is just trash, just burn it. And he was well known for saying horrible things to doctors. So he would meet doctors who had wealthy practices and degrees and all this, authority. And he would tell them that if they were ever tested by a serious disease themselves, and he said, quote, "all your splendor, titles, rings, and name will be about as much help as a horse's ass." Some people translate that a horse's tail, but knowing Paracelsus, I think it would be. And when asked his opinions of the masters of medicine of his day, he famously pointed at flies that were buzzing around on dog excrement in the street. And he said, "The flies remind me of the doctors and the excrement of their so-called knowledge." But he also had strange beliefs himself. He believed, for example, that if you had lustful fantasies about somebody else, and then especially if you had a nocturnal emission after that, because you wouldn't masturbate, that would be wrong. If you did that, then the emission and the fantasies would be carried off to be nurtured by toads. And they would give birth to astral beings that he called larvae. These are like incubi and succubi. And then they would then search for sources of lust to feed from. And this takes us kind of back to our egregore discussion. He certainly contributed to that. Now, why these ideas? So there's a scholar named Andrew Weeks who wrote a wonderful book about Paracelsus. And he reminds us that Paracelsus was living at a time that was the end of the age of faith and the beginning of the age of science. And as he wrote, quoting him, "the atmosphere of his writing bespeaks a teeming anxiety, fear of diseases old and new, fear of the poisons that pervade everything in nature, fear of succubi, incubi, astral monsters, fear of war, violence, and false accusation, and not least of all, fear of ridicule." Because Paracelsus was ridiculed a lot. He was homeless often. He was dismissed by lesser intellects. He was excluded from participating in many of the medically oriented activities of the day because of his allegedly radical approaches that were producing superior results. And so the doctors didn't want that competition. Ficino wrote on medical subjects like how to treat the plague. And this was an important and direct influence on Paracelsus, but also it was an influence on a bunch of these mostly anonymous writers who wrote what were called plague tracts. And this was kind of philosophizing about the causes and treatments of this deadly reoccurring epidemic. And most of these were filled with ideas from Ficino. So Ficino and Paracelsus both believed that the human body is a microcosm of the macrocosm. They experimented with what were called signatures and correspondences in nature, which we touched on earlier. This wisdom of harmony all throughout nature, the divine that can be glimpsed through it. And if you could read these things, these similarities, then you could find cures. And this led Paracelsus to explore scrying, to seek visions in mirrors and crystals and such, because he thought that everything in nature had access to this wisdom. Ficino, as we said, had that idea that the universal medicine was hidden in the world soul, in gold. And this had led Agrippa to publish his influential book on alchemy anonymously, that was so dependent on Ficino, as we saw. Well, Paracelsus took ideas from both Agrippa's work and Ficino's to shape the future of alchemy. And he really influenced how alchemists approached the art. He made the goal clear. We are not doing this to make gold for profit or fame. We are doing this for healing. The only reason we make gold is that it is the path to making medicine. And that really established a tone for at least a couple hundred years of alchemy following him. Paracelsus called Ficino the best Italian physician. And Walter Pagel has written that Paracelsus's whole life and work seems to be an attempt at implementing the ideal of Ficino's priest-physician. I think that's so true. And Weeks actually thinks that that's overstated a little bit. And he thinks that he points out, for example, well, there was definitely influence, but we can't say that Paracelsus is a direct disciple of Ficino, because Ficino is creating these books, these translations, and he loves these books, and Paracelsus is burning them, right? So Paracelsus is all about experience and getting knowledge now and not worrying about ancient authorities, whereas Ficino thought that the ancient authorities had the wisdom that we needed. So there were differences. All those achievements that we've looked at were especially amazing because Paracelsus was really hard to get along with. I mean, we can already see that he was quite caustic in his comments. He was given, for example, impressive robes of office because he did attain office, but he never wore them. He always dressed very plainly. And yet he managed to be ostentatious. He had this big sword. He wasn't a very big man. It was given to him by a hangman. He always kept it with him wherever he was. And people used to whisper that the pommel of the sword had a demon hiding in it, his demon familiar. He wasn't a handsome guy. He was thick-necked he had kind of a weird bulbous top of his head. He was only 5 feet tall. He had a stressed-out high voice, and he was causing, because of this gossip, that he had been castrated by witches or by soldiers. Researchers now speculate that he probably suffered from a disease related to childhood malnutrition. He had no children. He practiced abstinence and urged others to do the same. In his time, syphilis was an enormous epidemic. And in fact, he was ridiculed for constantly writing about syphilis, trying to cure it. He was accused of plagiarizing, even though he had no library, and he claimed to have not read a book in many years. He would respond by saying, I have invented 600 new formulas that neither my contemporaries nor the ancients had ever heard of. And yet, despite this cantankerous, volatile disposition, he was very well known for his sweetness and compassion for sick people, for people who were suffering. He was accused of being a magician, of course. If you read his writing, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that we associate with magic going on there, but he denied it. And he said that the people that were accusing him of practicing magic to hurt him, they're the ones who are actually using magic. And he did endure a lot of abuse. He was even called a monster. And maybe this is part of the reason he became fascinated with monstrosities. He did not consider them evil. He thought they were meant to be here, that they were put on earth by God. I think this is kind of poignant because I almost feel like he's speaking about himself. I'm not a monster. I was put here by God. And he wrote on this subject. He was one of the first people to keep records on monstrous births, making him a pioneer in the area that Charles Fort would dominate centuries later, which is excluded facts. He would collect all this. And he considered monsters, but also marvels, to be warnings, portents, and omens. He published books on astrology and on divination, including his own prophecies. And by the early 1600s, those prophecies were pulled out of his books and made into a collection which was called Theophrosti Paracelsi Prognosticon. Very popular book. And he made a prediction of a great calamity just beginning. People thought that he was referring to the 30 Years' War, and he probably was. He also wrote about nature spirits and elementals. We see in his writing for the first time undines of the water element, salamanders of fire, gnomes of earth, and sylphs of air. He wrote, "These are not good names, but I use them nevertheless. The names have been given to them by people who did not understand them." He likes to call these beings people, which is so sweet. He says that they are very probably the daemons, a Greek word usually translated as spirits, but usually people think it has something to do with demons, which it doesn't. No one's really quite sure how to translate it. But to Paracelsus, the Greeks were talking about these nature spirits. And he believed that Ficino had revived interest and knowledge of the nature spirits through his translations of the Neoplatonists. And he also said that, you can't pick and choose. You can't say Jesus is true, but the giants and the undines aren't. You can't just pick things. Either you believe in ancient truth or you don't. And he believed that science and religion were inseparable. He believed that scientific discoveries were direct messages, revelations from God. He was often compared to Martin Luther because he was so defiant of authority everywhere. And he responded to this, which was a slur that could have really hurt him at the time, in his usual off-the-cuff, direct way. He said, well, I'll tell you what, I'll leave it to Luther to defend what he says. I'll be responsible for what I say. And besides, what you wish on Luther, you wish on me. You want to put us both in the fire. So Paracelsus believed that nature was a mirror, not only in that human beings are in ourselves a miniature universe containing everything that nature contains, but also he suggested that we have a sort of magnet in ourselves that attracts to us what we experience. And our beliefs and our actions are what determines what this magnet attracts. So we draw our fate rather than being helplessly subjected to it. One of his companions left an eyewitness account of his later years that to me, when I read it, it kind of foreshadowed the 20th century bestseller Elvis, What Happened? He says, 2 years I passed in his company. He spent it in drinking and gluttony, day and night. He could not be found sober for 1 hour, end quote. But he's doing medicine and making these discoveries during that time too. Eliphas Levi wrote about this in a very interesting way. He said, and I quote him, "To strive continuously against nature, so that we may overcome and dominate it, is to endanger both life and reason." Paracelsus ventured to do so, but even in the midst of such a struggle, he made use of equilibrated forces. And so what does that mean, equilibrated forces? He opposed the intoxication of wine to that of intellect, then conquered drunkenness by bodily fatigue, and bodily fatigue by fresh intellectual occupation. So Paracelsus, Levi writes, was a man of miracles and inspiration, but he exhausted his life in this devouring activity. He rapidly wore out and destroyed the body he wore like clothes. But men like Paracelsus can use and abuse without fear. They well know that they can no more die than grow old, end quote. I think this is a reference to the truth that we discussed in the Secret of the Golden Flower discussion we had. It's basically saying that Paracelsus knew his immortal soul would not perish with his body. He was an immortal soul living his life, and was not concerned about what would happen to his body. He knew he would go on. And he was a huge influence on the German Rosicrucians. They called him a prophet, and they organized much of their ideas about medicine and religion around his ideas and his terminology. I wonder if that part of this was because Paracelsus did live for a time under the patronage of an aristocrat right in the area that Rosicrucianism would emerge from. And I think that very likely that, like John Dee, who visited those areas prior to Rosicrucianism, that these two, especially Dee and Paracelsus, left a great impression that the Rosicrucians later developed into their own approaches. Francis Bacon, on the other hand, he warned against Paracelsus and the Rosicrucians. He said, that the whole idea that man is the microcosm, which is an ancient idea, was fantastically strained by these people. He was a huge influence, Paracelsus, on the very influential German visionary author Jacob Boehme, who influenced generations of mystical German pietists, some of whom relocated in the very early days of the colonization of America. And Andrew Weeks, who also wrote about Boehme, says, a considerable stock of Paracelsian terms, concepts, and theories are found in Boehme's writing. So we see how strong that influence was. But unlike our other two writers, who were kind of limited in their influence just to the occult, Ficino may be a little wider in this terms of the Renaissance that spread from the Renaissance that he did so much to help create. But in the case of Paracelsus, the influence is much wider. So, for example, if we move forward to the early 1800s, we can look at Hegel, who's still considered one of the most important philosophers in the history of Western philosophy, although the right has traditionally fought to diminish him. He had in his library Agrippa, Boehme, Giordano Bruno, and Paracelsus. He was inspired by Ficino, but he considered Ficino's revival of Plato, the Hermetica, and the Neoplatonists, and the Academy to be what he called a puerile or childish fascination with a dead philosophy. Paul S. MacDonald, who we referred to earlier, he describes Hegel's classic book, The Phenomenology of Spirit, as Hegel's initiatory experience, Hegel's Aloysis, his bacchanalian revel. And he tells us that the great political philosopher Erich Vogelin claims that Hegel's thought belongs to the continuous history of modern Hermeticism, and that Vogelin refers to the Phenomenology of Spirit book as a grimoire. We move up into the 20th century and we find Carl Jung studying Paracelsus. He wrote 2 essays on him, one delivered in the house in which Paracelsus was born. And around that same time, Pabst, or Pabst, depending on how you want to pronounce it, the great German filmmaker of the Weimar Republic, who Goebbels denounced as a Jew, for some reason he returned to Nazi Germany to make films. But these were subversive in subtle ways. And one of the films that he did was paid for by the Reich. It was called Paracelsus. And in this film, Paracelsus performs a very impressive cure. He debates with the medical authorities, and then he humbles them. He's asked to become town doctor, and then the plague threatens the town. So he orders a quarantine and locks the town gates. Well, the local merchants aren't happy about this. And the richest merchant in town, who's a specialist in contraband merchandise, has carts filled with this stuff locked outside. The decision is made that the stuff is probably contaminated with plague, and so they burn it. Well, that doesn't go over very well. And so this man, this rich merchant, decides that this quarantine is illegal and unnecessary. It creates this huge political problem, very reminiscent of recent times. And supposedly Paracelsus in this movie had a young assistant who was drunk with love for the daughter of a patient and therefore administered a wrong dose, resulting in death. The town blames Paracelsus. And in the movie, there's like the shadow version of Paracelsus that appears, a street entertainer whose tightrope walk distracts the audience long enough for the real Paracelsus to escape. And modern film critics, and even back then to a degree, they point out that this was very probably a sketch of Hitler, who sold himself as the sole authority on healing the nation, but who was actually an actor performing for the public, doing these tightrope walks above crowds. And we move up into the 20th century further, and we find the visionary American author Philip K. Dick, who was a big Paracelsus fan. We have a quote from him where he wrote, "I am an Orphic, a Neoplatonist, a Christian, a Hermetic. All these statements are true. And also I have, to some extent, formulated my own system as Bruno did. I have seen God, but it was not God. It was more. And I have a cybernetics biological model. I am with Boehme, perhaps most of all, and with his teacher, Paracelsus most of all, end quote. So big influence there. According to the pioneer esoteric scholar A.E. Waite, as late as the 1890s, just about the only place where people with occult interests could find Paracelsus was in the writings of Eliphas Levi. And Levi has some interesting things to say about Paracelsus. He gives him the honor of being, quote, the most sublime of the Christian magi. He declares, quote, his success was prodigious, and never has any physician approached Paracelsus in the multitude of his marvelous cures, end quote. He also wrote, quote, the cures of Paracelsus were miraculous, and he deserved that there should be added to his name the divine, because some writers called him Paracelsus the divine. But in other places, Levi tempers this high praise, and he says, I think referring to this other statement, well, we may call the divine Paracelsus divine if the term be understood in the sense of a diviner. He's an oracle, but not invariably a true master. He is great as a physician above all, for he had discovered the universal medicine. Yet he could not preserve his own life, and he died while still young. He was only like in his mid-40s or late 40s. He died while still young, worn out by his toil and excesses, leaving a name of fantastic and doubtful glory, based on discoveries by which his contemporaries did not profit. And he gives us some insight into his personality when he says his life was incessant warfare. He traveled, he disputed. And then he has this wry description that I like. He says, he has divined more than anyone without ever completely understanding anything. There's nothing to equal his intuitions, unless it be the audacity of his commentaries. So while he had all these notable achievements, there was a tendency to idealize him historically. So he's been presented as, the first modern doctor, as I said, the founder of toxicology. He's an initiate, an magus, an ascended master. He's a theological rebel who inspired generations of independent mystics. In some sense, he is all those things, especially as a myth, but he is also none of those things. He did not set out to inspire the Western esoteric tradition. He was not studying ancient tomes like Ficino. He was being Paracelsus. He was walking the pages of nature with his feet. Are we as moderns looking at him and trying to read into him things that weren't there? Here's a good example of it. He said that coral is a good way to keep away night spirits. These are spirits, good or bad, that can interfere with people's lives. And for that, he was condemned as a sorcerer. But today, there are scholars who argue that he was talking about the effect of the unconscious on human behavior. Night spirits who can interfere with our lives, and that he didn't really have the language to explain it until, it wouldn't be the language until Freud came around so many years later. And so his writing is like this forest of symbols, and you're not entirely certain of the meaning, and there's so much room for projection. So he's been dismissed as a total quack, but he's also been held up as this incredibly brilliant human being who revolutionized not just the world of medicine, but these other areas as well. So these three people that we've been discussing, they are really at the foundation of what we now call the Western esoteric tradition, or at least formulating it as a stream of influence. And their lives only span 100 years altogether for the three of them. But to me, that's amazing. As I said, from the birth of Ficino to the death of Paracelsus. And yet, look at what they produced, the change that they produced. And I think this is a very timely topic, even though we didn't really intend it to be in this way, because I'm hearing from so many people now who are so upset by the recent election, and they have a very bleak view of the future, and they just kind of have surrendered to despair, many of them. And while I've been trying to deal with that, I've been thinking about Ficino and Agrippa and Paracelsus and thinking, my God, compared to our world, what they had to face was infinitely more difficult and more dangerous in so many ways than the world that we're in today. And yet these three strange guys, Ficino, a guy who would get really depressed, Agrippa, who's getting in fights everywhere, and Paracelsus, kind of the same thing. These three people utterly changed European history and the history of the world. They changed our lives because the ideas that they developed absolutely changed how things are done in the world. And they faced incredible poverty, ridicule, and all the kinds of things that are going on now that people are talking about as being obstacles to having good lives. And so in thinking about these three people, I really want to emphasize to people that these are not superhumans. These are not fonts of perfect wisdom. They're just people. I think it's beautiful to think of it that way, but these are devoted people. Because the thing that you see that's common to all three of them is they wanted to share vital wisdom. They drew inspiration from various sources, and they wanted to change the world with it. They believed that the divine wants us to have this information, that we can transform the world and free ourselves of tyranny and ignorance and sickness by loving wisdom and by respecting those who came before us and who did so much and risked their lives, really, for us to have this wisdom. And so I think that they're a wonderful example to us today of the possibilities that are there when somebody really lives a life that is devoted to the quest for wisdom. If we devote ourselves heart and soul to this quest, then not only can we radically transform ourselves, Agrippa goes from being a mercenary soldier to being this author who influences hundreds of years worth of occultists. Paracelsus, who was this almost a town fool, in the way that he looked and behaved, but he changed the worlds of toxicology and medicine and religion and so many other things. And it shows you that it's the devotion. It's instead of being focused on what we can't do or on fear of what might happen next or how powerful the authorities against us are. For instance, someone might respond, well, how can you say it's more dangerous now? We have nuclear weapons, we have climate crisis, we've got Elon Musk with all the powers of technology to tell what we're thinking and all that. Nobody has come up with a better way of knowing what everybody's thinking and of controlling people than the confessional booth. And in those days, if you didn't go to confession, you were in trouble. So many of the same problems facing us today, wealthy elites that are trying to suppress the poor, trying to suppress knowledge or controlling information and such, who want to keep people feeling like there's nothing they can do, they're helpless, and they have to do what they're ordered to do. That's the world that Ficino, Agrippa, and Paracelsus faced. But look what they accomplished.
Do we have information about the death of Paracelsus besides what Levi reported?
We have a lot of stories. We don't really know what happened to him. As is usual in these cases, we have reports that he was poisoned. We have reports that he caught something that he was treating and died from that. We have, a jealous doctor killed him. I mean, there's all these myths that grow up around it, but we're not sure.
Well, Ronnie, this has been a fascinating conversation about a crucial period of world history and three individuals who I think probably 50% or more of our viewers will not have known much about at all before. So thank you so much for this really enlightening discussion.
Oh, thank you, Jeffrey. Thank you for suggesting putting these three together. That was brilliant. And they do belong together, in my opinion.
Well, we've been going for over 2 hours. So for those viewers who are still with us, I commend you and for your diligence. And thank you for being with us, because you are the reason that we are here. And Ronnie, of course, I thank you too, and look forward to many more conversations.
Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
You can now download a free PDF copy of issue 7 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine or order a beautiful printed copy.